So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
It's our weekly happy hour here on Trending, and my question of the hour for you is, are you afraid of being happy? What do you do that prevents you from being happy? Do you do it on purpose? The number's 1-888-914-9149. We'll talk about everything from impostor syndrome to do you self-sabotage? I think this topic of unpacking whether or not we are afraid of being happy is a really important one, because I think as we talk every Monday here on Trending, if you've never joined us before, I'm Timmerie. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. We talk about anything related to the topic of happiness and ultimately overcoming this need and desire for the fleeting emotion of happiness that comes and goes, just the way sorrow or anger can come and go. It's a transitory emotion. It's not lasting. And so the goal is, as we talk about the pursuit of happiness, what we really need to talk about is the pursuit of joy, which is a gift, and it is actually rooted in God. That even in the face of sorrow, despair, good days, bad days, that we're rooted in God and we're able to have this eternal perspective, this hope-filled perspective, and this source of joy that is rooted in God. And so I want to unpack today during this hour of whether or not we're afraid of being happy and see if this is actually getting in the way of our happiness. As I mentioned, with everything from self-sabotage, is this something you do, to impostor syndrome. Joining me today on Trending will also be celebrity and Royal Matchmaker Cristina Pineda, and we're going to discuss together self-sabotage and imposter syndrome, specifically in light of dating and relationships, but also I'll talk about it in general as well if you're not quite in that phase of life. I want to talk a little bit about how it's so easy for us to have this sense of self-inflicted punishment, guilt, hate, and fear. I think all of these four things tend to be things that prevent us from pursuing lasting joy and even momentary fleeting happiness. I think as we, for some reason, will put ourselves in a state of mind or in circumstances because we think that we need to be punished for something or we don't deserve something. Maybe because we feel guilty about having done something. And I think that all of this is really important to have a conversation couched within the context of reconciliation as Catholics and what our Lord is calling us to. No, I think a lot of the fear surrounding whether or not we're afraid of being happy is a really important perspective that a lot of people, I think, are actually afraid of being happy. If you'd like to join the conversation today, the number is 1-888-914-9149. Do you want to be happy? What do you do that prevents you from being happy, and do you do it on purpose? Those are my questions for you. I'd love to hear from you. You can comment on my Instagram story or give me a call. The number is 1-888-914-9149. Fear is, I think, a tricky topic because so often we tend to have fear with everything from fear of responsibility and taking on responsibility, fear of commitment, and also fear of requirements that might be placed on us if we say yay or nay to something. It's interesting. I think this has to do with avoiding possible pain of any perceived type of discomfort. This seems to be quite the trend in current culture, that we don't make commitments because we don't want what will come with that commitment, the responsibility, the requirements, the pressure. We see this in the fear of committing to relationships, jobs, or even living situations. I made a joke a couple weeks ago when I was talking about this woman I'll never forget. I was teaching Pilates and she was probably about 35, 40 years old. And she said, yeah, I was adulting all weekend long. And I thought, that's such a weird thing to say. You're like 35, 40 years old. I said, oh, why was that? She said, well, I bought a house and I was having to take care of things all weekend for my house. I think it's bizarre when people in their mid-30s, approaching 40, say that they had to, quote, adult. Isn't it fascinating when they see taking on responsibility, being a homeowner, having consequences or upkeep on a house is something that they consider almost old-fashioned, or even a thing that their parents would do, not them. It shows this attitude in many ways of perpetual adolescence, and I think it's stemming from fear. Perhaps you have a thought on this. The number's 1-888-914-9149. Perhaps you self-sabotage, or perhaps you've experienced imposter syndrome. It's something that a lot of people try to push around surrounding women and the feminist movement, and that women are forced into having this imposter syndrome. Do you think that's the case? What do you do to prevent yourself from being happy? Do you do it on purpose? The number's 1-888-914-9149. When I think about this topic, and again, I want to hear from you, are you afraid of being happy? I think of how I think it's easy. I don't think I'm afraid at all of being happy, but I do know that I get in the way of my own happiness at times, and ultimately working toward being joyful. For me, it's easy to allow my mental peace to be compromised, I guess you could say. We've all done this, overanalyzing things, reworking and overly criticizing and obsessing over past conversations or past actions, having this very self-critical type of attitude. You might even say it's a fear of imperfection. But some things I've noticed that are really important, as we all have our own things that get in the way of our happiness, is that it's important to recognize when it's time to move on, let go. It's also helpful, and I think that this is something we've lost as a culture, to do two very important things, to pray and to read. And I say these two things specifically because when we pray and when we read, we're occupying our mind with that thing we're reading, with contemplation of God or devotion and prayers and aspirations to God. And we're not occupying our minds with any negative thoughts, emotions, feelings, self-criticism, self-hatred, or hatred or criticism toward other people. You see, the need is to work on reclaiming our mental peace. I think reclaiming our mental peace is something that's so important that we take back yet again. Again, moving on, letting go, allowing our mind to be occupied with prayer and reading. This is one of the great reasons why people tend to read before they go to bed at night, because it calms their mind, allows their mind to unwind, allows their mind to get rid of all of that junk floating in their head still that's getting in the way of a restful night's sleep or just a peace of mind. Another thing that helps with clearing the mental clutter is exercise. It clears the mind, focuses the mind, helps you to get all the endorphins and hormones and chemicals working to cultivate the brain in the direction that it needs to go. Stagnation, when I talk about stagnation, physical stagnation and or the mental stagnation on specific topics, over criticizing, overworking and reworking over and over again, are all things that really do impact our happiness. And that's why when I was thinking about this, what do you do that prevents you from being happy? And do you do it on purpose? I had to really take stock, and I know that that's an area where I can see within myself that I have to be aware of. Perhaps you have a thought on this. The number's 1-888-914-9149. We have Dawn on the line from Des Plaines, Illinois, commenting on whether or not she gets in the way of her own happiness, and do you do it on purpose? Dawn, what are your thoughts?
Hi, I'm a little overwhelmed to be talking. I just found your channel today. Somebody gave it to my husband. God's always putting an angel in my way. I think my problem highly is anxiety. I've been homebound for a few years due to lymphoma and don't get out much, pretty much don't have many friends. I have a great support system in my husband and my sister, but I find it's hard to find my joy that I had 4 years ago. I feel too much frustration with the world and the poor and what's going on. I seem to take that all on. It includes animals, trees, climate, and I'm just really trying to figure out how to get my joy back.
This is a really good question, Don. It sounds like between being homebound and the state of the world today, it's frustrating and it's impacting the bottom line for you. This really reminds me, Don, of, and by the way, Don, welcome to listening to Relevant Radio and here Trending with Timmerie. I'm so happy that someone told your husband and you about Relevant Radio, and I hope you continue to listen and enjoy the programs here. I keep thinking of John the Apostle in 1 John chapter 4. He said, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and he who fears is not perfect in love." And as I was really pondering this, because I think this comes back to your question, as I was really pondering this, when you talk about, everything that's happening in the world and your experience of getting in the way of lasting joy, I think a lot of what's happening for many of us as we watch the news, as we watch, what happened this last year with the election, as we watch what's happening with the state of faith and morality and religion and everything in the culture, what I've realized is that we need a greater sense of detachment from what's happening in the world. And this brings me back to 1 John chapter 4, what I was just mentioning, where we talk about perfect love casts out fear. Why perfect love? Because fear has to do with punishment. And I think that when we talk about perfect love casting out fear, when we have a rightly ordered sense of attachment to people, to things, to places, to ourselves, that rightly ordered love to ourselves and others and all of these things is what allows us to be joy-filled, what allows us to be rooted in God, to have God's perspective on the world. And yes, we can even think about the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. And when we talk about blessed are those who mourn the state of the world, the separation of people from God, the horrible things that are happening. But when we say blessed are those who mourn, it should also be emphasized and recognized that we're mourning the separation from God, but we take hope and joy and solace in the connection, in the union we do have available to us in God. And that is so important that we're keeping that perspective in mind. But as I was really thinking about this, especially when it comes to getting in the way of our own happiness, I think a lot of people tend to try to punish themselves when it comes to their state in life. And they tend to think, well, I don't deserve to be happy. And a lot of this, I think, especially from a Catholic perspective, has to do with our lack of devotion and regular reception of the sacrament of confession. Are we self-inflicting perhaps punishment because we're unrepentant? Are we self-inflicting punishment on ourselves, not allowing ourselves to be happy because of that thing we did, the circumstances, this attitude of I don't deserve, or I don't think I should have, or I hurt someone else, or I was hurt by another. And so we continue to allow this narrative to function within us, and we look at everything that's happening in the world and we allow ourselves to be taken away with it. Whereas in reality, we need to have this perfect love that does cast out fear. We need to have this perfect love that we turn to God the Father and we're allowing Him to heal us. We're allowing Him to set the path and the direction in our lives. I think all of this is so important for us to keep in mind and keep perspective as we're talking about this important topic of whether or not we get in the way of our own happiness. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. The number's 1-888-914-9149. What do you do that prevents you from being happy? And do you do it on purpose? Give me a call. I'd love to hear from you. Joining me now is Cristina Pineda. She's a royal and celebrity matchmaker, matchmaking us peasants, single folk as well. And we're going to unpack self-sabotage as well as imposter syndrome, both in light of relationships and dating, and I'll also unpack it in general. So don't go away, even if you're not in that state in life. As always, joining us with her wise relationship advice and candid perspective is Cristina Pineda. Cristina, welcome back to Trending.
Thanks, Timmerie. So happy to be with you.
Let's unpack the topic of self-sabotage. I think that this is fascinating when we look at the current state of dating and relationships. A lot of people today tend to engage in self-sabotage, I would say, when it comes to weight loss, relationships, career, or even their own religious observance. But I want to talk with you specifically now about how you see this perhaps as a trend among your bachelors and bachelorettes.
Yes, unfortunately, this is all too common. And some of the ways that people can self-sabotage their love life include being overly picky, completely discounting people if they don't fit every single requirement, traveling too much, being out of town. And I'm saying these specific things, and I'll list a few more, but where I'm actually thinking about a bachelor who we were working with, who we were trying to matchmake, and he just kept sending us all of these new requirements that he wanted, and then he would be constantly traveling. But apparently he's so upset that he's single and tells everyone that he wants to be in a relationship, but then he does these behaviors that make us wonder, actually, I don't really think you want it that badly, because you're self-sabotaging it. You're not allowing anyone in when you have all of these walls built up. But those are some of specific ones that were brought up to my mind about this bachelor. And then other things that we've dealt with in the past include people canceling dates last minute, being flaky, unreliable. And this isn't common, the canceling dates and flaky and unreliable, for the people who we matchmake, because we usually screen them really well to make sure that they don't have those characteristics before that we would even match them on a date. But it happens. We live in big cities, and there's always, people think they're the bigger, better syndrome of, there's always, oh, well, if I do this, then maybe I'm going to miss out on something else. So all of these ways really get these things really get in the way of meeting the right person for you and being able to have the romantic relationship that you're longing for.
It sounds like, as you're talking about this, because self-sabotage, for some people, it can be two extremes. It could be perfectionism that's being implemented, or on the other end, it could be a sense of procrastination. But in the respect of what you're talking about when it comes to self-sabotage and dating and relationships, it sounds like it's that perfectionism where people kind of fail to see the importance of incremental approaches to things. That, okay, this person might not have everything on my checklist, but they have a few really great things, and I could at least get to know them a little bit before I completely write them off. It's even this idea of perfectionism where, a lot of people will say, well, I'm not going to do anything if I can't have it perfect. For example, I'm not going to clean my house if it's not perfect, or I'm going to view my house as an absolute pigsty, even though the kitchen's clean, the dishes are done, the beds are made. There's this almost a negative perspective, while at the same time trying to implement this perfect ideal.
Yes, it's true. And I think it also leads people to romanticize other things from their past. For instance, with self-sabotage, you have to talk about the Phantom X. Have you heard of this before, Timmerie?
What's the Phantom X?
Okay. If you've studied attachment styles, or I'm sure you've heard about attachment styles and attachment theory in terms of dating, there's a few different ones. There's anxious, avoidant, secure. But one of the classic symptoms of an avoidant attachment style is having this Phantom X in their minds of someone from the past who you romanticize, an ex-boyfriend, an ex-girlfriend who you're no longer dating, but no one can measure up to this person. And you're not with them. They're clearly not the one for you. And even if they could be single, but you're not with that person. But every person you meet, you try to compare them. And this is very, very problematic, because you will never get what your vision of that X is, because it's not real. And that's one way that someone will continue to go down this path of perfectionism that doesn't exist. And then also using the words, I'll know with my soulmate and know that he's the one or she's the one, and then I'll change. So it's important to, instead of thinking, okay, when the right person comes along, then I'll be more Catholic, or then I'll stop eating this thing that's causing me to gain too much weight. It's important to change now and know that every change that we're making for the better, that God is going to bless. But if you are just waiting for that person might never come around.
Yeah, as you're talking about this, it really goes against our Catholic understanding of the human person, what we're created for, and even the commandments themselves. You're talking about an idealism, and I'd even argue an idolization of another person. And, the first commandment, I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no strange gods before me. It seems as if when we talk about this self-sabotage and this perfectionism, that at the end of the day, what we're actually doing is we're creating a fake idol of what we're working toward, and we won't allow ourselves to be happy until we have that thing, and that thing or that person is not God.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And just a specific example of this, I actually have one of a bachelorette and one of a bachelor. But we worked with, this has happened a few times. It's so crazy. It doesn't seem like it would. But we worked with a few very deeply religious and spiritual women. And I think one of them had converted to Catholicism, was really into her faith. But then when she started working with us, she chopped off her hair and dyed it orange. And she was looking for a conservative Catholic man. That made our job nearly impossible because those men weren't looking for what she was presenting. They wanted, and that's why a lot of times the self-sabotage and what we'll talk about soon, the idea of imposter syndrome, a lot of times we're not living in a real world with it. We're not realizing that, okay, what we put out is what we're going to attract. And so it's important for you to dress and present yourself in the way that you want to attract the kind of person who you want to be with. So knowing that about ourselves, having that self-knowledge of, okay, I need to present myself in the right way. Otherwise, the right person won't come along.
Right. So
what
happened?
Was one
what did you
example.
do in this instance? I mean, she dyes her hair orange and chops it off. It sounds like she does not want to actually date someone, but she's going to you to make it seem like she's taking the right steps. But in reality, she just blocked herself from meeting someone. And some might say, well, it's so superficial. You're talking about orange hair and short hair. But in reality, that's actually like the first line of getting to know someone and be interested in them is actually your appearance.
It's true. It's true. So we initially matched her with the kinds of men she wanted, the deeply religious ones, but of course it didn't work. And then we started giving her men who were less religious, more, I guess progressive would be the word, even though I don't think cutting your hair is progressive in a good way, but you know what I'm talking about. So then we did that, but then the men would come to us saying, well, she's so religious, I don't feel right dating her. It put us in a very hard spot, and we continue praying with her and working with her, but it's a challenge.
You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. That's Cristina Pineda, the celebrity and royal matchmaker. She's been featured on everywhere from TMZ, Access Hollywood, you name it. We're going to come back and we're going to discuss more of now the imposter syndrome, and we'll also talk about imposter syndrome and self-sabotage in general, not just when it comes to dating. You're joining us during our weekly happy hour. I'd love to hear from you. The number's 1-888-914-9149. Catholic Order of Foresters is proud to sponsor the Relevant Radio studio line. For information about employment opportunities and flexible premium life insurance plans, visit relevantradio.com/forester.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
It's our weekly happy hour here on Trending, and I would love to hear from you. What do you do that prevents you from being happy, and do you do it on purpose? The number is 1-888-914-9149. You can comment, share your thoughts live, or can reach out on Instagram. Follow me at Timmerie, that's Timmerie. We're going to talk about self-sabotage in general as well as imposter syndrome. But before we do, joining me now is Cristina Pineda. She's a celebrity and royal matchmaker. And we're going to talk about imposter syndrome specifically when it comes to dating and relationships. If you're not aware of what imposter syndrome is, this is what many people say is getting in the way of their own happiness. And it's this idea that you might be qualified to do something. Let's say, for example, you studied, you went to school to become a therapist, you have your license, you're a licensed therapist, but you think you're an imposter, you're a fraud, you aren't qualified. What are you even doing being a therapist? A lot of people have experiences like this. And so you start to almost self-sabotage or prevent yourself from doing well. Or it might even be you're doing well, but you can't recognize your successes, your achievements, and you tend to be very self-critical. So I want to talk about imposter syndrome with Cristina Pineda. You can find her at matchmakersinthecity.com from the perspective of dating. How do you see, Cristina, imposter syndrome peeking its head in the dating scene today?
Yes, and I think also with self-sabotage, all of it stems from extreme insecurity. And a lot of people are insecure. We live in a very competitive world and a place, especially in with the dating, where people feel like they have to compete with each other to get the person, get the girl, or get the guy. And that's total lie. That's a total lie. If you feel like you have to compete with someone, they're not the right person. The person you're competing for is not the right person for you. So I want everyone to know that from the beginning. And this extreme insecurity can lead people to unhealthy relationships, to dating manipulative people, dating narcissists. It can lead them to tolerate abuse in relationships. And you might wonder why is that person, why is that girl with him? Why he's clearly terrible for her. Why is that man with that awful woman? She treats him terribly. And this is where it stems from, that extreme insecurity.
It's interesting because insecurity seems to be something that has become more and more common today, and I really do believe it's due to this comparison culture that we tend to live in, especially in social media or even, the magazines, tabloid magazines that I know our generation grew up with. You see them at the grocery store, you see them everywhere. I was just at the airport and they're everywhere in the airports. And there's this comparison of one star to another. And you're talking about the elite or American royalty. And if we're comparing and critiquing and tearing down American royalty when it comes to those in Hollywood and everywhere else, all the more so we're doing that of, just so-called normal people that we see side by side with us in our everyday life in social media. And so this kind of lack of self-esteem is, I think, such an important thing to touch on when it comes to imposter syndrome in general, but especially in dating, because it really is a sense of self-sabotage, and it's a sense of self-hatred as well, ultimately. And that's not what we're called to as people of faith. We're called to see the great value that we ourselves have and that others have and the gifts we have to offer. I think of people who tend to say, oh, well, I have no gifts. I have no talents. I have no hobbies, and they'll complain, that's why I'm unhappy, or that's why I'm not talented, or that's why I don't have a job. And it's an excuse at the end of the day.
Yes. I was actually thinking about that because it is, in some ways, easier to let people get away with things than to have expectations to be treated well. And with this imposter syndrome with dating, you can feel like an imposter if you haven't had relationships in the past and feel like you shouldn't expect boundaries because you don't really know what you're doing. And this can lead, I think, especially women in certain circumstances, to feel like they're unworthy of a man committing to be a boyfriend, even boyfriend or girlfriend, even that simple first step in a relationship, or for you to compromise your boundaries. If a man, maybe, I can be with him. At least he's with me. He doesn't have to make me his girlfriend. or he doesn't have to propose, or you know what, I'll sleep with him before marriage. At least he's giving me attention, or I'll have his baby. So it goes down this path. And Timmerie, you actually just spoke about Nick Cannon and Abby De La Rosa, who just had one of his babies. I think two of his babies that were twins.
Oh my gosh, he's
But
had like 3 babies in 1 year with multiple women. This guy's a mess.
right. But you were saying how she's so happy to have this baby, but it's a baby who's out of wedlock. And so she didn't expect to get married before this. And yeah, maybe she'll be getting a lot more money than most women might if they have a baby out of wedlock. But it shows that there's this insecurity there, and that she also posts these thirst trap photos on her Instagram, even though she's a new mother. That I think this shows that a lot of people feel unworthy of the healthy boundaries and healthy relationships that the Lord wants us to have. The truth is, and actually the healthy part of imposter syndrome is that we don't deserve, and we're undeserving of any gift that the Lord gives us. We're all undeserving, but he gives them to us and he wants us to have them. And our infinite value and worth comes from him rather than any accomplishments, the amount of people we've dated, anything we've done in our lives. We're made in the Lord's image and likeness, and we're infinitely worthy and possess infinite value. So that means that we are deserving of healthy relationships, and we should not compromise, even if it's easier, to just try to get something that we might want. And I just think the truth is so important, that we are not perfect. We're all less than perfect. But the Lord wants us to enjoy these gifts and wants us to enjoy healthy, secure relationships and the appropriate titles for relationships, the appropriate marriage status when you have children. These are really important things to hold on to with relationships.
You know, it's interesting you bring up the Nick Cannon and Nikki De La Rosa story, and we'll post a link to that on social media now, as well as in the show notes, because it's a fascinating conversation. But as you mentioned, that this desire that Nikki De La Rosa must have had, like so many other women in our culture, that they just want a baby. It's so easy for women today, and we're seeing this with the turn toward third-party reproductive technologies in the late 30s and 40s for women who waited too long to try and have a child and now find that they can't. That so many women are finding they're desperate to have a child, that the idea of motherhood is their understanding years later is written into being a part of who they are. And there's almost a self-hatred or hatred and jealousy of others who have what you have. And I think that this imposter syndrome as well, in the Nikki De La Rosa story, reminds me of how one of the ways I think we get in our own happiness is by always focusing on the next thing that we don't have, and that by getting to that specific thing, that will be the only way we're happy. So for example, let's say you're 35 and you're single and you really want to meet someone and date them and you want to get married. Well, you are happy because now you're dating someone, but like immediately you need to be engaged. Immediately you need to get married. And then once you're married, immediately you're upset because you haven't had a child yet. There's always this chasing and never this sense of rest or peace or self-confidence in the state of life that you are in, or even a lack of gratitude for what you have.
Wow. Yeah, that's very well said, Timmerie. I was also thinking about some steps to overcome feeling imposter syndrome or getting in your own way, of getting in your own happiness. And one of the first things I thought of was getting to know Jesus, to getting to know the love that he has for us, and whatever point in life we are, whatever next step we think we should have already, that he doesn't care about that. He loves us where we are. And this getting to know that love will enable us to treat others with love, respect, and compassion that we will in turn treat ourselves with. I was thinking about the gospel reading. Actually, yesterday it was the gospel reading I went to Latin Mass, and it was about the king and the unforgiving debtor. It was Matthew 18, 21 through 35, just to refresh people's memory that the king forgave this man a huge debt, but then he turns around and won't forgive those who owed him money. This just reminded me that, yes, it's very important to forgive others, and we are going to be judged how we judge others. But the first step also is to forgive ourselves, that maybe you have had things. That's why Timmerie was talking about the importance of going to confession. And even after confession, though, some people will have that guilt on themselves and keep it. And you shouldn't. We need to forgive ourselves. And then when we forgive ourselves, we're able to show love to others. And then that enables us to see ourselves clearly and to have realistic expectations for what we can achieve, what we can accomplish, that those things, yes, we can go for them, but unless the Lord wills it and wants it to happen, it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. And when you have realistic expectations for yourself, you can then desire someone when you're dating who is a good person and has the main things that you're looking for, but you don't fall in the trap of perfectionism like we were talking about before.
That's Cristina Pineda from Matchmakers in the City. You can find her at matchmakersinthecity.com. We'll post a link in the podcast notes for today. Do you self-sabotage? What do you think about imposter syndrome? We've been talking about these from the perspective of dating relationships, but let's take a deeper dive and understand it from the perspective of how it gets in the way of our own happiness. I'd love to hear from you. The number is 1-888-914-9149. What do you do that prevents you from being happy, and do you do it on purpose? You can share your thoughts on Instagram or give me a call, 1-888-914-9149. I'll be right back here on Trending.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
You're joining us during our weekly happy hour here on Trending. What do you do that prevents you from being happy, and do you do it on purpose? I'd love to hear your thoughts. The number's 1-888-914-9149. You can also comment on my Instagram story with your thoughts or comments. I'll share them live during the show here. And also, I've been away the last week or so. I was at a family wedding, and lots of fun photos, especially of baby girl and I from the wedding. If you want to check those out there on Instagram, and also share your thoughts during the show. Again, number's 1-888-914-9149 if you'd like to have your voice heard during our weekly happy hour. And I want to unpack this a little bit more. We're going to touch on it in just a moment, but I want to share with you about how November coming up is the month we remember the holy souls, friends and family who have passed away from earthly life. Join us this November 2nd through the 10th as we pray a novena for your departed loved ones daily during Mass, the chaplet, and family rosary. Submit the names of your deceased friends and family today at relevantradio.com/souls, where whether you've known just a few holy souls or a number of them, submit them all. There's no limit, and they all need our prayers. Go to relevantradio.com/souls to create your list of departed loved ones. We'll all gather to pray a novena November 2nd through the 10th during Mass at noon Central, the chaplet at 3 p.m. Central, and the family rosary across America at 7 p.m. Central on the air, the app, and at relevantradio.com. Again, to share your thoughts during our weekly happy hour today, numbers 1-888-914-9149. A lot of comments have come in on Instagram, and you can share your thoughts there as well. Brittany was commenting on the topic of what do you do that prevents you from being happy. And she talked about the classic guilt after setting boundaries to help preserve her own energy or time, and really kind of this idea of setting boundaries with friends and family and how she feels guilty after. Isn't that interesting that we can overcommit ourselves even when we know we shouldn't, even when we know we need to allow ourselves to get sleep at the end of the day or whatever it might be, but we overcommit because we feel bad. We feel guilty for not saying yes to people or for not spending time with people. I experienced this even this last week. I was with my family, we were traveling, I was with my extended family, hadn't seen everyone in a while, and everyone's so much better at staying up late at night than I am, and I'm like a dead zombie, and I was also feeling sick, so I knew I had to go to bed early. And it's so easy to have that FOMO, you know what I mean? Fear of missing out, but also missing spending time with everyone and having fun. But at the same time, you have to know yourself and what is realistic in terms of an expectation so that you can enjoy your time with others. Or for me, so that I can take care of my baby while I'm traveling and that I'm not exhausted and failing to meet her needs. I think that it's fascinating that we tend to allow our boundaries that we do put up, or our lack of boundaries that we put up, to get in the way of us just taking basic care of ourselves. So many people struggle with chronic exhaustion from lack of sleep. A lot of people are turning to opioids and other types of substances to help ease pain, and it often turns into an addiction. When in reality, if we got more sleep and ate better, got a little bit of exercise and some sunshine each day, for many of us, all these things that we turn to help be a temporary fix that then becomes a problem in and of itself, all of these things do get in the way of our happiness. It is a sense of self-sabotage. So I want to talk about self-sabotage here, and I think that it's important. If you don't know what self-sabotage is, it's active or passive steps to prevent achieving goals. It could be, you're trying to lose weight, but you keep having way too many carbs. Maybe you're trying to do the keto diet, you're supposed to eat more fats, but you just keep going for all the carbs. I know that's been me. Finally, recently I had to be like, okay, what exactly are the macros, the number of fats I need, and what are the carbs, and let's not eat more than that. And we tend to say we're on a diet, but then we don't actually follow a diet. We just say we're on a diet. And same things could be said and done in relationships and career, or even our own religious observance. I mentioned earlier that perfectionism tends to be an element of self-sabotage, but so are laziness, apathy, procrastination, self-medication, as I mentioned, even gambling, or let's say you're trying to save money or live within your means, but you have no budget. So how are you going to live within your means or save money for that house you want to buy or that new car that you need? I think the solution that we have to direct ourselves to really has to do with matching our behaviors to both our short and long-term goals. I think that this is the only way we're going to overcome the self-sabotaging mindset. And you might even say it's not intentional. It may be actively done or passively. I think some people do actively and intentionally self-sabotage. But a lot of people also do it unintentionally. And that's why we have to take stock. For example, I mentioned maybe we're trying to save money to buy a house or a new car that's needed. Well, if we don't have a budget, if we're not sacrificing other things, we're never going to have the money to buy that new car or that house. A lot of people struggle with hypoglycemia and getting hungry and grumpy. That classic phrase, hangry. Well, you can prevent yourself from being grumpy and angry and mean to others and yourself if you simply make sure that you eat every 3 hours or eat on time rather than skipping a meal. This perfectionism is that perspective that also has to be addressed when we talk about self-sabotage. We mentioned it a little bit earlier, but perfectionism can lead us to dismiss achieving minor things and just continue to self-criticize or even criticize others. I mentioned earlier, for example, for me, I might want my house to be perfectly clean. The reality is I've been away for 2 weeks and there's laundry to be done and laundry that's waiting to be folded and suitcases to be unpacked. But I could at least acknowledge the bed's made and all the dishes in the kitchen are done and not give up, but actually recognize what has been done or what can be done, rather than maybe not doing anything at all or recognizing the little achievements. Or on the other end of the spectrum, we talk about self-sabotage, this procrastination mindset that's so common, of where we set vague deadlines, or we have negative emotions about getting something done, so we avoid and we avoid and we avoid it because we don't want those negative emotions, but in reality, they continue to build all the while. Or even just the distractions we have that's leading us so often to procrastination, social media, texting, overcommitments. We have to make sure that our behaviors match our state in life, responsibilities, goals, hopes, and even the person we want to be. And I think this all brings us to the idea of impostor syndrome. Imposter syndrome is a part of this entire idea of what's preventing us from being happy and what's getting in the way of our happiness. Because I've heard from a lot of people commenting on social media today, and I've asked, are you afraid of being happy? And a lot of people are saying this is a great question. And they're saying this imposter syndrome is the big thing that gets in the way for them. Now, imposter syndrome is really, we have to get out of our own head. It's really a sense of self-obsession, fear, or anxiety. Imposter syndrome is where someone has the qualifications or has achieved something, but they can't recognize the achievement or think of themselves as unqualified even though they have the qualifications. Perhaps you don't recognize your own talent or successes. This could be said of anyone from a parent who is seriously self-doubting and feeling like an imposter in their parenting skills, ignoring the fact that God chose them to be the parent of that child and equipped them to love, nurture, raise, and shape that little human being. A therapist can experience this as well. I mentioned this earlier. You might have the degree, you might even have the licensing, but then you find yourself in the therapy room and you're wondering, what am I even doing here? What qualifies me to do this? And you have this self-doubt. You see, the culture tells us that we are never enough. The culture tells us that we always need more education or we need to hit that next achievement. Okay, let's say you're finally in a serious dating relationship after a long wait. Everyone's already harassing you about when you're going to get engaged, rather than recognizing the fact that you're finally dating someone and you're happy. And sure, you think this could be potentially the person you're going to marry, or you're trying to figure it out, but everyone's already pushing that next step. Other people do it to us, we do it to ourselves. The culture is always acting as if nothing's enough. It's this cog in the machine mindset of constant progress for the sake of progress, rather than the Christian worldview, understanding that the human person inherently has value. The human person is someone to be celebrated, to be loved, to be sought after. I think part of what helps us in overcoming this idea of imposter syndrome is when we accomplish something, we debrief. You give yourself a pat on the back, celebrating some of the successes. You have some lessons learned, figuring out what can be worked on, how you can grow and do better. I think also it's a reminder of the importance of humility, the virtue of humility, and recognizing that even in the good things that we achieve, we acknowledge that we have achieved good, but that it's God Himself who accomplishes those things within us. I love the litany of humility. And I think that even for people who struggle to understand their own worth, or who struggle to think that they think they're an imposter, humility is necessary because they're putting too much burden on their own shoulders. I think another means of overcoming this imposter syndrome is by incorporating more silence into our lives. When there's silence, we tend to have that natural capacity to debrief, rewind, pause, ponder. It allows us to trust in God's providence and see His perspective, because silence should ultimately lead us to prayer, to cultivating that prayer life, which should lead us to a sense of holy confidence and to seeing our own God-given mission given our state in life. I think Scripture has a lot to say when it comes to imposter syndrome. Even just think of Psalm 46, be still and know that I am God. Or even when it comes to imposter syndrome, and I mentioned this earlier, I think imposter syndrome in and of itself goes exactly against the first commandment. I am the Lord your God, you shall have no strange gods before me. You see, when we overly emphasize ourselves, our inadequacies, not within the proper context of humility, but just self-criticism, we are making ourselves too important. We're idolizing ourselves or even others in a certain respect. We read in Matthew chapter 6, Isaiah, and many other places all throughout sacred scripture, where God says over and over again, he calls people to a mission, and he says, do not be afraid, I am with you. Do not be afraid, I am with you. Over and over and over again, our Lord, from the dawn of creation to the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, gives us this message. Do not be afraid, I am with you. So as we're talking about, are we afraid of being happy? Do we prevent ourselves from being happy? Do we do it on purpose? Do we self-sabotage? Do we experience impostor syndrome and feel like a fraud? All of this goes against the Christian narrative. The prophets themselves, from Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel. Prophets, if we were to look at what the word means to be a mouthpiece of God. And I think of the words to Jeremiah, where we read Jeremiah chapter 1, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. You see, Jeremiah then responds to God, Ah, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a youth. Then God says to Jeremiah, and he's saying these same words to you, do not say I am only a youth, for all to whom I send you, you shall go, and whatever I command you, you shall speak. Be not afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you. And then we read that our Lord places his words in Jeremiah. Will we trust in the Lord and allow ourselves to be happy with humility and great love?